Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio. I am your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, and no, my voice will not sound like this for the entire podcast. I'm using it to get a point across. And really, I need to confess something to you. Right now, I'm using my software-defined radio and a walkie-talkie to record this intro, an SDR radio antenna that I picked up for $20. I love it when hobbies are cheap, or at least cheap to get into. An SDR is one of those things that you can get into for about $20, and it is what you are hearing right now, and you can do so much cool stuff with it. So let me change microphones to my higher quality microphone, and we'll get on with the podcast, and I'll tell you all about SDR.
Okay, this sounds a little bit better. So yeah, the full backstory here is that I didn't record a podcast last night because I got so distracted with tinkering with my SDR radio. It sounds redundant to say that SDR radio because SDR stands for Software Defined Radio. And basically what it is, it's a USB dongle with an antenna input and effectively free range to tune into any frequency conceivable in the radio spectrum. Now, most SDRs are limited to basically at the lowest around 1 megahertz, a little bit below that, all the way into the gigahertz frequency range, so well above 5 gigahertz. And for some perspective here, when you turn on your FM radio to listen to music or whatever you listen to on FM radio, those radio stations start a little bit above 88 megahertz and end just before, at least in the United States, 108 megahertz. So 88 megahertz to 108 megahertz. That is what FM radio operates within. CB radio, Citizens Band Radio, at least in the United States, also operates, I believe it's between about 26 and 27 megahertz. 26 and 27 megahertz. There's 40 assigned channels, about 10 kilohertz in width each. I believe it's 10 kilohertz in width each of bandwidth, between 26 and 2700 megahertz. Below that, or around there, you have shortwave radio and all sorts of stuff happening lower in the frequency spectrum, maybe a little higher in the frequency spectrum. The point is, an AM radio operates in the kilohertz spectrum all the way up until just over 1 megahertz. For instance, my radio show broadcasts on KPRC 950 AM. That means it's at 950 kilohertz in the radio spectrum. So there is a whole lot of real estate and lots of different devices and lots of different agencies and lots of different radios that operate all over the spectrum. Aircraft operate around 131 megahertz, just over FM radio. You have other operations at 118 megahertz. I think marine radio, like watercraft, things out on the ocean and on the lakes, I think that's around 150 megahertz, if I'm not mistaken. It's not critical that I get the exact spectrum just right. Just the point I'm trying to get across here to you is that there's a whole lot of spectrum to explore there. Your internet routers, for instance, operate at 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. If you have an SDR antenna capable of picking up those frequencies, you can listen to what's being put out of your modem. Now, don't be too scared by that, and don't be too excited about that either, because all you're going to hear coming out of your modem in the 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz ranges, it's just going to sound like gnarled tones, basically. It's remember old dial-up modems? That's all data being transmitted over audio. Or over the electromagnetic spectrum through the phone lines and what have you. You can do it over the air as well. And matter of fact, there is a ton of digital information being sent back and forth in the upper registers of the radio spectrum. So when you get into ham radio territory around 400, above 400 megahertz, thereabouts, 445 megahertz, I think ham radio also goes down to 140 something, 160 something megahertz. It doesn't. All I'm saying is a lot of ham operators send digital signals back and forth up to and including what's called slow scan TV. You can send pictures back and forth because all you're doing is using these radio frequencies to send packets of data back and forth. So if you tune in to listen with your ear with one of these SDR radios, I know that's going to sound redundant, but that's what we're going to call it. One of these SDR radios plugged into your laptop, again, cost $20. You tune into one of those frequencies and you hear that garbled mess of noise and tones. That's data. And if you have one of the functions of SDR radio that you can do is decode that data in the ham bands. To my knowledge, I'm sure there's a way you could decode what's coming out of a modem, but a wireless router, like a Wi-Fi router, but that's not really the way it works. You could do it. I'm just not personally aware of how it's done. I'm not going to pretend to tell you how it's done or even know how it's done. And the other thing is that I'm learning all this as well. I just started this less than 24 hours ago, and it's so incredibly fascinating. I'll interject here that I am going to include links below in the podcast description to kind of get you headed in the right direction if SDR is something that you sound like you might be fascinated by. And let me tell you right now, it is just a tinkerer's dream. When I went up to the GTR studio at home to record the podcast last night, I thought, I'll just hook up my little antenna to this USB port and just, mess around with it for 5 minutes before I record a podcast. And then I'll record a podcast based on my tinkerings for 5 minutes. Nope. I spent 6 hours in one of the most joyful, engaging, arguably therapeutic, but just one of the best tinker sessions I've been in a long time, where the time flew. It's the kind of tinkering session where time just flies by. I'm sure if you build Lego sets, you've experienced this. If you're on a roll with art, you get into a zone. It's like Zen. I've talked about that before. When you get into this kind of zone with tinkering, or zone with art, or zone with whatever your geek thing is, that your mind kind of achieves this Zen-like state. And that's what I got into messing around with SDR radio last night, and I was coming across some very fascinating sounds, very fascinating things coming through, especially above 1 gigahertz. There is some neato stuff happening up there, going around the ham radio frequency ranges, and I can't transmit. I cannot transmit with SDR radio. I can't. You can if you get so into it and you get the necessary equipment and the necessary knowledge. Yes, you can transmit. That's how people do transmit images and transmit videos and even set up entire email systems with SDR radio and ham radio. And that's one of the cool kind of one of the cool things you can do with ham radio and SDR radio is, let's say, just for example, there are a million things you can do with ham radio if you get your license and with SDR, just with radio frequencies, period. Let's say the grid goes down. Internet goes down. You don't have access to your Wi-Fi. The electricity's out. Cell phone towers are down. You can actually use ham radio to check your email and send emails. You can tap into your local radio repeater. There's repeaters dotted all over the earth, basically, especially over the United States, to carry a little 4 to 5 watt signal thousands of miles. All you need is that little 4 to 5 watt signal to hit a repeater, and then that repeater bumps it up, amplifies it to hundreds of watts, maybe 1,000 watts, and just sends it all clear to the next horizon and the next horizon and the next horizon at virtually the speed of light. So you can still be connected to a network. That's why a lot of preppers like ham radio, because if everything goes down, you can still do security. You can still do a lot of survival things with ham radio. A lot of agencies, FEMA, Red Cross, all that still rely on ham radio operators to go into areas that have been devastated by floods and hurricanes and earthquakes and set up networks to establish communications in emergency situations. That is just one of the facets of ham radio, one of the areas where SDR can get involved or come into play. And you use ham radio and SDR to send these digital data packets back and forth so that you can check your email when the rest of the entire grid goes down. Now, I'm not getting into ham radio and SDR for any sort of prepper situation. I don't quite have that kind of doomsday outlook on the world. I don't blame people for having a bug out bag and prepping. I think it's very good. But in the back of my mind, I'm also thinking, you know what? Even dabbling in all these things might come in useful one day. It's better to have knowledge and know something and not need it than need it and not know it. Last night, my wife called me resourceful because our power goes out from time to time in our home, and that just it creates an inconvenience that you have to reset your Wi-Fi router, reestablish your internet connection, all that stuff, because the power goes out and the router gets reset and the modem goes down, and it's just a pain in the butt. And my wife called me resourceful, which I don't see myself as resourceful. I'm a nerd. I like tinkering with stuff. I have an old UPS backup power supply. If you don't know what that is, that's basically one of those glorified surge protectors with a battery built into it so that your computer will keep running, for instance, during a power outage, so you can save your work, shut off your computer you may have 5, 10, 20 minutes left on that battery in the surge protector. So you can safely turn off any electronics plugged into that battery backup surge protector. So I have one of those in the garage. They cost about $30. The battery inside of it is long dead. I don't even know how many amp hours the battery is. It's 12-volt lead acid for sure. Probably 3 or 4 amp hours, 6 amp hours at best. But I'm going to see if I can revitalize that battery, if I can clean each cell, each of the 6 cells of the battery, 2-volt cells effectively adds up to 12. See if I can replace the battery acid in there and get it running again, because that all goes back to the Wi-Fi router and the modem. I want to at least have the Wi-Fi router and modem plugged into that battery backup. So when the power goes out for 5 minutes at a time, we don't have to continually reset our modem and Wi-Fi router. Basically gets you over that time where there's power out. And since a modem and a router don't really suck up that much juice anyways, you can run it for more than 5 minutes. I would estimate more than 5 minutes to get you over that hump of no power. Just an ease of life thing. So my wife said, I love how resourceful you are. I like fixing stuff. I'm not doing this stuff. I'm not doing all these things to be a prepper or know how to get ourselves out of dangerous situations or anything like that. But when the world goes to crap, you turn to geeks. That's the simple end of the matter there is geeks. We are very fascinated by a lot of different things. And the side effect of fascination means that we pick up some things here and there. Very useful information, not just how to change a tire when you get a flat tire, not just how to patch a tire, not just how to change oil and fuses and things like that, but actually maybe know how to operate a ham radio, have a basic understanding about how radio frequency works, maybe be able to build an antenna if you need to, maybe build a battery out of lemons and a nickel and a penny to power a basic transceiver or a spark gap generator to start generating SOS with a spark gap. A spark gap transmitter will be picked up for a good distance around you, farther than you can yell. So SOS. I don't know what the Morse code for SOS is off the top of my head. What is it actually off the top of my head? Isn't it something like that? I don't want to repeat it too many times because I think I can get in trouble for mimicking it. Definitely on a broadcast, I can get in trouble for mimicking it, but on a podcast, I think I'm safe. Anyways, build a radio, Dr. Howell style from Gilligan's Island. Basically, build a radio out of coconuts and some wire for real to be able to send out a distress signal. And you learn all those things from just picking up these geeky things as you go through life, just being fascinated by things, having a basic understanding of how physics works and how electricity works and how radio transmissions work. And that the first radio transmissions were Morse code with a spark gap transmitter, basically a little electric arc that arcs through the air as a lightning bolt that zaps through the air between two poles, an anode and a cathode, and it electrifies the air around it, and that's an electromagnetic signal that can be picked up with antennas, and you can do basic Morse code with it. The first communications wasn't radio communication, although it was used also with radio communication. I feel like I'm talking so fast, but I'm just on a roll here with my geeky stuff. The telegraph and telegrams. Railroad tracks used to have connections to the telegraph wire that would line the railroad tracks, so that when you would sit there on the tracks, you'd be completing a connection between the wheels and the track, and it would go to the telegraph wire and run thousands of miles back to Chicago and back to New York, so you could be sitting in the caboose of a railroad car in 1867 and be telegraphing back to your banker in Chicago what stocks to put into the railroad company. The Titanic was able to communicate with other ships in the early stages of radio, 1915-ish, with telegraph over radio frequencies. That's why they were able to establish that the nearest ship that could come to the rescue was 4 hours away. And that was a dire situation because the ship would sink within the hour, so 4 hours is no help. But that's how, in the northern Atlantic, how they were able to talk to each other. Just basic radio transmissions, transmitting Morse code. You didn't need much for that. You can basically use a bunch of lemons. The acidic juice in lemons is the electrolyte. That's what transfers electrons back and forth from the anodes and cathodes. That's what creates a loop of electricity, completes the circuit. You can do a lot with it. All you need to do is put that electromagnetic interference out into the air and put a pattern to it, and you can get rescued. That's very basic stuff that just soaks into the geek's brain. Hopefully you never have to use it, but it's there if you need it. What was I going to mention? It was along those lines of having it and not needing it, needing it, not having it. Oh, what was I going to say? Let me get back onto SDR because that is the meat and potatoes of this podcast tonight. Man, slow down my talking. Why am I talking so fast tonight? I'm just so excited. Yeah, so I'll tell you a bit how I got my SDR radio. It's one of those things, just get on Amazon. Get on Amazon, less than $20, you're up and running. You can invest more money into it. $100 gets you a really, really good SDR. One thing to consider is the antenna. Usually these come with little antennas, and they're fine for picking up, plenty to get you started, plenty to be fascinated with, for sure. But different radio frequencies require different types of antennas. Wavelengths of radio transmissions correspond to actual physical distances of antenna length. So if you're transmitting on a 70 centimeter band, that means that the actual radio wave is 70 centimeters, or the distance between the two peaks of the radio wave is 70 centimeters, and you want a 70 centimeter antenna or a variable of that, so 70, or you would want 140 centimeter, or quarter of that, or half of that. You want those variables to be either half or quarter, or 1-to-1 70 centimeters, or twice 70 centimeters. So if you're operating on a 70 centimeter band frequency range, you'd want that kind of antenna versus on a CB radio, what is it, 11 meter, I want to say, 33 feet. Is that right off the top of my head? That the frequency of CB radio at 26 to 2700 megahertz is a physical wave that is 33 feet thereabouts in length and amplitude or whatever. All I'm getting at, don't quote me on the specifics there, but different antennas are more tuned to certain frequency ranges. That's one of the things with 5G, 5 gigahertz, or the 5G network. If it's supposed to operate within from 20 gigahertz to 90 gigahertz, the antennas in there, the actual wavelength of those frequencies are minuscule, are absolutely tiny, which means you need a teeny tiny antenna. I'm talking like a millimeter. It's called millimeter wave for a reason. It's because the wavelength is as small as a millimeter, and that's how big the antenna needs to be to pick it up most effectively. So, and that also means that the antenna is really small. That also means that the antenna is blocked by things like your hand in drops of water in the air. One reason why 5G is going to be a freaking logistical nightmare to lay out. But different radio frequencies are tuned, need antennas that are tuned specifically for those radio frequencies. So back to SDR, think about what radio frequencies you're going to mostly want to dabble with and get antennas suited for that. So if you're going on to Amazon or eBay or whatever to get antennas for your SDR radio, think about what frequency ranges you want to most operate in or tinker with and get an antenna for that. And then if you want to switch to another frequency range that uses a different length of antenna, have that antenna also that you can unplug or unscrew from your SDR, screw in the new antenna. They also make antennas that are good at the kind of general operation, general frequency ranges. You can pick up antennas like that. So it's cheap to get into. You can also build your own antennas. That's a lot of CB radio and ham operators build their own antennas, especially ground plane antennas. High frequency range antennas like to be ground plane, which means that they are, I believe, parallel to the ground. Wires that basically run from the roof of your house over to a tree, 30 feet above the ground, 33 feet long or whatever. They're specific antennas. And again, don't quote me on specifics of what that is. Look it up. I will provide some links below to get you started with SDR radio. So here, let me tell you how I have been using SDR radio within 24 hours, what I'm looking for. When you first fire up your SDR, you plug in your SDR antenna into your USB port. You fire up your SDR software, which is free and readily available. You get your drivers going just right. There's a tiny bit of rigmarole to getting the drivers to work, but it's well laid out. It's super easy. You can be up and running in 2 minutes, literally 2 minutes. Anyway, so here's what I look for. When you first turn it on, you're going to see a lot of spikes and a lot of different peaks and ridges and valleys and flat plate areas of the radio spectrum. And you're going to see steady spikes. It's going to look like a mountain range. It's going to look like a spike of information that's just sitting there, and it's unwavering, and it stays a spike. It doesn't really move. It doesn't go up and down or move left or right. It's just one continuous spike. Usually that's radio interference, or it could be a data transmission. It needs to be a constant signal, constant volume to transmit data like that. What I look for also, though, the more interesting things to look for with SDR, and this is probably the best takeaway that I can give you for this entire podcast if you're getting into SDR, look for the spikes that are variable, that are going up and down and not in any sort of synchronous oscillation. That's a big word for how regularly it goes up and down. But look for spikes that go up and down with irregularity. That's usually somebody talking. The irregularity of the spike going up and down is the natural amplitude and changes of human speech. And that's where you're going to hear things like emergency services. That's where you're going to hear things, security. That's where you're going to hear ham radio guys and gals talking to each other. That's where you're going to hear air traffic and air traffic control and airplanes and boats and helicopters and building security and all sorts of stuff. Look for those irregular spikes that go up and down, kind of in the rhythm of a human voice. That's where it gets interesting. Not that the static spikes aren't interesting. There are some interesting things there. Also interesting are the spikes that roll across the frequency spectrum. Another thing you can do with SDR is literally listen to the universe. You can listen to Aurora Borealis. You can listen to ions hitting the atmosphere. You can listen to the northern lights. You can hear radio frequencies generated by Earth processes itself, by Jupiter, by things flying around the solar system. One really cool thing to do with SDR is during meteor showers. The meteors, as they burn up in the atmosphere, as they fly through the atmosphere, reflect radio frequencies back down to Earth. So, what you do for a meteor shower is you tune your SDR radio to your local FM radio station, and you're locked onto the radio station right there. You're jamming to tunes. What you do is go a little bit further to the right or to the left of that radio station in the frequency band, and you can watch. There's a graph that charts. It's a histogram of the strongest radio signals, and so what it looks like is very bright lines in the histogram of very strong signals, that if the signal goes away, the line goes dark. Then the signal comes back, the line lights up again. So you can see over time, and it's called a waterfall. It constantly flows, so you can see where a signal started, the duration of the signal, and then where it ended. So one cool thing to do for a meteor shower is you tune your radio, the SDR radio, and you can also do this with any handheld radio, really, if you just want to listen to it. Go a little bit away from your local FM station, and every time a meteor goes through your area, through the sky above, it's going to reflect the radio station back to you a little bit. It's not going to sound like Britney Spears singing louder or anything like that. It's just going to sound like a whoosh, whoosh, psst, psst. So the shorter little psst, that's a little meteor that burned up as quickly as it hit the atmosphere. The longer ones are the meteors that last a little bit longer. And you can see it on the waterfall of the SDR software. You can see not the actual meteor, but its representation on the frequency spectrum, its intensity of radio waves that are reflected back to your antenna. And it's really, 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 really cool. And you use it. It's an easy way to also count meteors. And you can also print out that waterfall over a bunch of sheets of paper, and you can circle all the little marks in the histogram where the meteor and what time it came through and its duration. Really cool stuff. And I have not even begun to scratch the remote beginnings of the surface of what you can do with SDR. And it's, again, something that you can get into for less than $20 and runs on virtually anything. And I will leave links below. I'll leave an Amazon link or two just to some basic SDRs to get you started. But mostly it's going to be the tutorials, kind of software guides and things like that to get you started. It looks intimidating. It can be easy to get into. But I'm going to help you out with that below. I was just trying to tantalize you a little bit. If you're a geek and you like tinkering with stuff, SDR is dang near free to get into. Well, $20. You can spend a few $100s if you really want to. But to get into it's $20. It's just so gratifying. It's such a gratifying thing to tinker with. And I'm super excited about it. And I'm really tired. And I hope when I go home tonight that I don't spend another few hours tinkering with SDR. You know what's really cool? On the way out, just thought of it. One thing I'm going to tinker with here is a lot of SDR users like to use it with their Raspberry Pis. That's a really, really cool idea. Basically get a Linux version of SDR software readily available. I'm going to try to see what I can do with my Raspberry Pi Zero. It's that little computer the size of a stick of gum, basically. Get some SDR software running on there. The possibilities are endless. I'm so excited that I'm getting into this hobby. It's so freaking cool. Anyways, thanks for listening to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. I talked fast because I was very interested in what I'm talking about tonight. Geeking out about it. Where else am I going to go to geek out about things but Geek Therapy Radio. Thank you for listening. Know that you are worthy of love. I keep forgetting to put this stuff at the beginning of the podcast. Know that you are worthy of love, both giving and receiving love. You are worthy of your own self-respect. You're going to learn what you're capable of and feel good about yourself when you dabble with SDR radio if you're so interested. You're going to be, hey, this is pretty cool. I can do that. Get some happiness and joy in your life out of tinkering with things. Who knows what kind of path it's going to lead you down, what kind of community it's going to connect you with. SDR is really cool. Radio in general is really cool. Ham is really cool. Ham radio is really, really cool. I can't wait to get my license. $15 to get your license in ham radio, and it unlocks the floodgates of radio tinkerings. You don't need your ham license for SDR. So lean into your geek thing. We're all geeks about something. Tell your friends about Geek Therapy Radio if you enjoy the show. That would be amazing. Geek Therapy Radio is also on YouTube. I'm working on my new video, Q6600 video. I'm chugging along, plugging along with that. Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook, Geek Therapy Radio Instagram, Geek Therapy Radio on Twitter. Tell your friends, get connected. Let's geek out together. And until tomorrow, see you then.
Therapy Radio, Saturday night at 10 on KPRC 950. Or listen anytime on our iHeartRadio app.